I think that we will find applications where LLMs start to make sense, both in terms of capacity, accuracy, and pricing. And so I think there's going to be 2025 is going to be the year of monetization of AI, and it's going to be explosive over the next 2 or 3 years.
You're listening to Talk Commerce. Subscribe and download at talk-commerce.com.
Welcome to this episode of Talk Commerce. Today I have Paul Byrne from Razoyo. Paul, go ahead, do an introduction for yourself. Tell us your day-to-day role and what you're excited about in business this year.
I'm the founder and the president of Razoyo. Razoyo started as an e-commerce consultancy in 2011. We've been around really a little bit longer than that. We started as a merchant. So I've been in e-commerce just over 15 years. Currently, my focus is one on evolving the company and making sure that we're keeping up with trends, not only trends, but requirements in technology, but also updating kind of our marketing and sales efforts. So I think I do the typical president/CEO things where I'm really working on the business and not in the business. And I have a group that works for me that we have about 40 different customers. Half of those are in e-commerce, maybe a little bit more than half are in e-commerce, but a little bit more than half of our business is in the custom application development. So I kind of oversee that whole process and make sure that we're keeping up and we're delivering value to our clients.
Yeah, that's awesome. Working on the business instead of in the business sounds like an EOS or an entrepreneurial organization term. Scaling up, Vern Harnish, blah blah blah. So we didn't even talk about that in our green room, but I won't get sidetracked on EOS or any of those monikers for business development or how to run your business. But all right, so Paul, before we get started though, I do want to get in our free joke project.
All right.
The only reason I know that you wanted to come on today is to hear my joke. So
absolutely. No
I'm
question.
going to tell you a joke. Just give me a rating 8 through 13.
Gosh, okay.
So here we go. And I've got a good one. So here we go. I got blamed by my wife for ruining her birthday, which is ridiculous because I didn't even know it was her birthday.
Okay, I'm going to give that a 12. Yeah, maybe 12.5.
Excellent. Wow, better than 10. Thank you.
No, that's a good one. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of truth in my life to that. Maybe I don't think I've ever forgotten her birthday, but I've probably come close.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the problem with Shop Talk is it happens at our anniversary. Even worse is I'm in Entrepreneurs Organization. We do a retreat every year, and I scheduled our retreat for our 30th anniversary. I agreed to the schedule without thinking of the date, March 27th. That is important for our 30th anniversaries. Anyways,
So I have been, my biggest complaint with the Magento conferences was that I was always gone on Mother's Day because I'd have to travel out on Sunday. Yeah. So that was not the most popular week in my household. Let's just put it.
Yeah. Well, in Minnesota, Mother's Day is on the opening of fishing. I mean, if you know anything about Minnesota, I think half the male population is gone anyways for fishing for Mother's Day.
Oh my gosh. So you have to choose between fishing and the Magento. Oh, well, they don't have them anymore, but the Magento Imagine conference.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Paul. So tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned 15 years. Tell us a little bit about how to give us some background. And did you always do custom application, or did you really start in Magento and then moved into some of these other custom SaaS products?
So it's been kind of a constant evolution. My background is actually in marketing. I was the chief marketing officer for an organization for about 7 years. Before that, I worked in PepsiCo, and I was in marketing, corporate marketing for a couple of brands, Frito-Lay and Pizza Hut in the restaurant division. I got into tech because I became a merchant. And when I became a merchant, and I've always had kind of a penchant for technology, so I was able to figure out a lot of things on my own. I was using a SaaS platform at the time called Pro Stores, which was an eBay property, and they purchased. So I ended up offering some other services directly to eBay, but I ended up working with the pro stores merchants, providing consulting for them, and then Magento Go, which has since 2014 was sunset at the same time pro stores was. And so I got into the business of helping other merchants because they kept calling me up and they're like, man, like we're not going to have a website in a few months. And so we started migrating. And that's really how I got into the development side of things. I started hiring developers and we developed a consultancy around that. And we realized, hey, like this software development stuff is really, really cool. And we're pretty good at it and people like our work. So we expanded that. And then as part of, I guess the whole move to Magento 2, which was a bit of a I don't know if you remember those days, but they kept pushing back, the end of life for Magento 1. And so the effect on us as an agency was all our clients stopped doing development work. They're like, well, we're not going to build anything on Magento 1, but Magento 2 is not ready yet. So we're going to wait for that, right? So I don't know if you experienced that same lull in business, but I know a lot of the presidents and founders of agencies did. And so we had to adapt to that and we expanded to other platforms. But also part of what we got involved in was middleware. And there were just so many things, it used to be great to have their standalone Magento incidents. You just load the thing up with extensions, whether they were purchased or you built them on your own. But all these services came up that needed to be connected to Magento, and there weren't necessarily the connections for those. So we started building middleware. And that's how we got involved in just what I would call, straight on software development. And we had been building our internal tools for a while on the Elixir stack. And we realized like what a fantastic method this was. And we could really do a lot of neat things with Elixir. And we started dabbling with creating our own SaaS services. So we created a SaaS service for online firearm merchants called Automatic FFL. And then which is still running. It's actually the predominant FFL extension for BigCommerce. And it's been growing in Magento and WooCommerce, which we released last year. And now we have really started doing that kind of work for other clients. So my focus now is really how do we make great applications, whether digital products, generally web applications, but we also build custom SaaS applications or custom SaaS platforms for our clients. So that's really kind of, where we're focused now. And of course, with AI, like everybody wants to know how we're going to integrate it, what we're going to do with it, what kind of value it brings to the table. So that's clearly been a big topic for the last couple of years.
Yeah, no kidding. So I know in the green room we talked a little bit about DeepSeek, and I saw you had a piece on LinkedIn. I wrote a piece just because my dad had called me and said, "Hey, do you hear about this DeepSeek thing that happened?" And we had a
Well, it's
little
a
bit of
whale, the
language.
little thing's a
Yeah,
whale.
a little bit of a language thing. And I wrote an article as well as just a little post, not an article, but I wrote about it on LinkedIn. So
Mhm.
tell us your background or your thoughts on it, on the DeepSeek and what happened and the stock price and
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of, I think a lot of people have covered kind of most of what happened. The release came out about a week ago, and that's when the NVIDIA stock price just tanked. And so, we've been trying to figure out like, why was that? Because for me, when I looked at it, I said, it's not like a lot has changed here. This is a new open source model. But there have been open source models and really good ones. Meta has an open source model called Llama, which is headed by Jan LeCun, who has a very specific slant, I would guess, on research, which is very different than the Anthropic and the OpenAI guys. And I love open source models because the LLMs, the value that they bring to the table, these large language models, is kind of limited. And most applications, you get the most value out of running a model. And there are so many open source models available. I mean, just go into Hugging Face, right? And so, if you want to do anything from text classification to translation to, transcription or even beyond that, there's probably a model for it. And you're better reaching into those models, attaching through whatever endpoints or whatever, way they give you to feed data into those models and get it out to deliver value than the large language models. Now, they definitely have some specific applications where you need one of those, but for the most part, they don't. So for me, I feel like investors just kind of discovered the fact that there are open source models out there, right? And people can get this for free. And those open source models, like I can, I ran one, I ran DeepSeek 14B version on my Mac Mini, which is just M3. It's not even the M4 chip, and it does a fantastic job. I've done that with, Llama, but I mean, just download Llama, download the model, and type in run, and you're ready to go. And you can attach any sort of software you're developing to it with a little bit of prompt engineering, not a lot. You can create some pretty fantastic experiences. So for me, it wasn't really that earth shattering. And I couldn't figure out why NVIDIA stock would tank. Now, I think the argument obviously was that, well, they used a lot less compute power on the model itself. And I kind of have my doubts about that because they weren't actually forthcoming with a lot of the details on it. They have been buying tens of thousands of NVIDIA chips, just the prior model that you could use for it because of export restrictions, et cetera. It's a Chinese company. And then also for me, the other problem is as I started to use it, I don't know if you tried asking it what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, but it flat out refuses to answer that question. And there's a lot of stuff in there that, it feels like propaganda, even worse than, Google Gemini image generation or something like that. So for me, I don't see US companies using it very much for anything that's sensitive. And the thing that you most use the large language models for is chat moderation, things like that. And if I've got a lot of bias in there, yeah, it's cheaper and maybe building my prototype, I'm going to use it, but I don't think I'm going to use that in production. So that's kind of my standpoint on there. The Chinese have their agenda, and basically, every Chinese company rolls up to the Chinese Communist Party. Think about what happened to Jack Ma. I don't, I just don't see this as becoming like, it's not game changing to me. And it looks like the market agreed because the NVIDIA stock price is back up. In fact, the more efficient we are at training models, the more models are going to be trained, the more value is going to be created, right? Like I think it's just going to generate more competition and more market for companies like NVIDIA.
Yeah, that's super interesting because while you were chatting, I just put in Tiananmen Square protest 1989, and it rejected my request contest, and I did an API request, but content exists risk is the response. I sent it to Gemini, and it gave me a whole thing about Tiananmen Square protest 1990 series of demonstrations, protests, blah blah blah. So yeah, I didn't even think of that aspect of it, that it's gonna rewrite history in its own, and I suppose that's the danger of a government run operation like that, that you do end up either not showing that bit or restricting it.
Yeah, it's even more draconian than TikTok's algorithm, which you know, rips out about 90% of anything that would be critical. If you look at the video I did, I actually did a video where I go through and I'm using the desktop model and I'm trying some of these things out. And the desktop model, which is really cool about this, is it gives you like these think elements, like it looks like an HTML element. And as it opens it and it walks you through the think process, and then it closes that, and then it gives you the response. And it was clear that it had identified me as someone who was concerned about China because I asked the Tiananmen Square thing first. And then I asked some other question about China. Oh, I asked what the Epoch Times was, which is, the Falun Gong sort of supported media outlet. And, of course, the Chinese don't like that. It's China's. And so it said, oh, this guy's concerned about the, the credibility of my answers because of the Tiananmen Square question. It identified that. and that he's concerned with Chinese topics. So I need to present something to him that's believable, right?
Mm.
Not true, not accurate, believable. And then it goes through and it produces its response, which what was interesting was like the first paragraph of the response was factual. It basically said what the Epoch Times was, but then it's kind of trying to dissuade me from using or believing anything the Epoch Times says. So it's a pretty big problem, and a number of people have asked it, about human rights abuses, and it will give you a massive list if you ask about the USA, and in China it has like only things that they publicly admitted to, which is almost nothing.
Right.
So it's a big problem. But think about it this way: that's just from a political standpoint. What if I'm trying to evaluate which piece of equipment to use, and how do pieces of equipment that some industrial equipment I want to buy on the market, is it going to favor Chinese companies? Is it going to lie about their capabilities and their safety records, et cetera, the way it does about the other aspects, the political aspects? So for me, it's just inappropriate for any Western company to use it for something that might be influenced by the Chinese perspective. But if you're asking it, physics or other types of questions, that's probably okay.
Yeah, it kind of leads you down the path too that is there a slant in all of them, right? There's probably somewhat of a slant, maybe not a political slant, but certainly a slant, maybe Llama a slant towards the products that Meta produces. Although if it's open source, it may not be.
Well,
Just
open
so,
source doesn't mean like you can see how it's thinking, right? It
yeah.
just means the weights are produced. So I can't predict any sort of level of bias just looking at the weights of the models.
Explain to so I have Olama and I tried to run I think I tried to run DB and it just like my machine is just my
32B,
lap.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
crashed
it
my
just
system.
killed
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But just give us the idea for the average listener when you run your own private one, when you're running it on your desktop, does that mean you're still pushing back to their main system, or are you running it literally on your own where you're not taking in or pushing anything back to the actual learning model?
Yeah, so I think what you want to look, and I think you did this, right? Like you used Olama to run it,
Hmm.
same as I did. I trust Olama not to do that. I don't trust the Timu. I forget what the name of their widget or whatever it is. So it's like this core application, right? That runs the model. So the model is
Hmm.
what's open source and it's all the weight. So you have to have both pieces to run it. So if you're running on your local system and you're using Olama and not Wagon or whatever the other thing's called by Timu, then I trust that nothing's going back to them. And I looked at my network traffic and I didn't see anything that looked suspicious, because that was definitely a concern. So I think that's pretty good. So yeah, no, you're not reporting back to them. And that's true no matter what model you're running in Olama, whether it's, a Chinese model or Western or US model. It's residing there on your own machine. Or even if it's on a server like in the cloud, it's going to be local. All the data is going to be there. Now, if you use the web interface and you ask it a sensitive question, and you log in with your Google ID, I think you're flagged. Somebody in China is worried about you now.
Yeah, not to belabor the subject, but I think in GitHub, if you're using Copilot and you actually do put in your GitHub ID, then it'll automatically change it for you now on GitHub, which is I've done it by mistake, and it changed my key because I put in my public key
Really?
by accident, and it changed it
Yeah,
for
yeah.
me. So I mean that's a great safety measure, but I don't think the other ones are going to be so like you said, the Chinese ones are not going to be worried about those safety measures. In fact, they're going to want you to put in that sensitive information to make sure that not to make sure, but just so to collect it and have it for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anybody that doesn't know, like we're at war, and their national strategy is to hoover up as much information as they can into their systems, and even encrypted information. I don't know how to describe the relationship, but I have a friend. I have somebody I've known for quite some time who works for a pretty large Chinese tech company. He's American, and he's telling me that their quantum computers can now decrypt, what would have taken, 20,000 years in just a couple of seconds. And so that means, like, you think about the implications for Bitcoin, if the Chinese can manipulate that, et cetera, it's really tough. But even if you have encrypted information, they're going to be able to get. So, like, you just don't want to, you want to avoid them getting their hands on as much information as possible.
So, just kind of closing off the subject of DeepSeek, I know one of the things that I had brought up was the amount of money they spent to do it. And I think it's a lot of the way how fast they got there was just by scraping ChatGPT to accelerate the development process.
There are a lot of problems with their story. One is, yeah, they definitely, well, I don't know. Sam Altman, who, by the way, I don't hold up as one of the great truth tellers of the world, but Sam Altman has accused them of scraping Chat GPT to get their information, which he illegally scraped, from the rest of the internet. But
Right.
that's kind of beside the point, right? But I think that is an issue, but there's a lot of problems with the story. Like, oh, they only spent $6 million on it. Yeah, if you look at this, that's not exactly true. And if it only took them 6 months, then why is their data set bound to October 2023? Why is it 18 months old? And I ask it specific questions that make it very clear, like, when that is, what that time frame is. And it came up and it says, yeah, like, I'm only able to answer things through October 2023. It's you know, I don't believe the story, especially since it's coming from the Chinese. But I probably wouldn't believe it if it came from, OpenAI either.
Yeah, I think that the $6 million is something they said, which nobody can know how they possibly got there. The other part was the fact that it's open source, so they're not necessarily spending money on all their own infrastructure. Can you comment on that?
Right, that's true. So I would note that their parent company had purchased over $500 million worth of compute power from NVIDIA. And they use some of that for trading, but I think they kind of admitted that about half of that was for AI and half of that was for them. And then, yeah, like they're based on, things that came before them. They wouldn't be able to do it without Olama, which was, developed by Meta. And so I'm just like, I don't believe the numbers. I don't believe the story, but I think it's one of those things that you have to keep in mind is that, oh, we may be able to do this a lot cheaper. Now, the process that they used for training the model, which I think was the LHR, I can't remember the acronym for that, where you're using kind of you're not training on the entire world's data, and you're kind of creating a lot of your own synthetic data to train on, which is a much cheaper process, and it's iterative. That particular process is not new to them. They didn't invent it. They borrowed it, stole it, whatever you want to call it, from others who already had that process available. Like the cost of training the same amount of model capacity is reducing as we go. And that's, that's going to happen over time anyway. So, which if it didn't, I don't think people would be investing as much in the compute power because it becomes more valuable to them as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think any new model is going to take something from other models to learn and do better for itself. And so it's only going to get better and hopefully less expensive to develop new models. So I think that's probably a valid point.
I agree.
Paul, so we have a few seconds left. What are your predictions this year for AI and what's going to happen out there with all these different models?
Wow. So I think the trend, and this seems to be confirmed from a number of folks, but I think the trend towards monetization of the models, I feel like up until at least the last half, maybe, the third quarter, fourth quarter of last year, there were too many problems with the LLMs and some of the models that they just weren't reliable enough to make them feasible. I don't know if you tried to do any programming with it, but the common complaint is that I try to get AI to help me program stuff, and yeah, it can be helpful in some cases, but a lot of the time it either chases its own tail or produces code that's just not good, and so I have to fix it, or it'll go in and introduce new errors that weren't there before. And this is a common problem for Cursor, and the Cursor team admits this freely, that they have a ways to go. But I think that we will find applications where LLMs start to make sense, both in terms of capacity, accuracy, and pricing. And so I think 2025 is going to be the year of monetization of AI, and it's going to be explosive over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, that's awesome, Paul. As I close out the podcast, I give everybody a chance to do a shameless plug about anything they'd like. What would you like to plug today?
Well, if you're building an application or thinking of building an application, product managers, I would ask you to visit Razoyo.com and reach out to me. I'd love to just have a discussion with you about whatever it is you're working on. That you can actually schedule me directly on LinkedIn. So my LinkedIn is /PW and that last name is, well, it's on the screen, but it's PWBYRNE. And I love to talk to people about their projects, and would love to hear from just about anybody. So anybody that's in the tech space.
And do you have any conferences you're going to next that people can find you in person?
That's a good question. So we haven't finalized everything yet. I'll probably be at Elixir Conf Poland, which is in May. But most of the conferences that I'll be attending this year are either online or they are going to be kind of very industry specific things. So it's probably not even worth mentioning them.
I'll give a plug for your SFL SaaS. If people are in the gun industry, I would definitely connect with Paul. And in my past experience, we wrote a couple of different FFL extensions for Magento. And if you can access a SaaS that's already done, it's so valuable for your company, especially if you're running Magento or Shopware, anything that allows you to sell guns online. It is the piece of the puzzle that really solves everything.
Yeah, we have quite a few features that are, beyond just kind of forcing the checkout, that allow you to curate your list, have featured FFLs, but also we keep it up to date, all the, with the latest ATF information. And we keep things like running very, very smoothly. And we've never had any downtime at all. And our response time is incredibly fast. It's probably faster than your current checkout.
That's awesome. Paul Byrne is the founder CEO of Razoyo. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Brent. It's really a pleasure to see you again.
Talk Commerce is a production of Content Basis LLC. For more creative content, go to contentbasis.io.